When I stood at the threshold of life and death, everything around me faded away, and all that was left was the reality of eternity and the presence of the Lord Jesus himself. And in that holy moment, he revealed to me mysteries that I had only read about but never fully grasped in the depths of my heart. And one of the greatest truths he spoke to me was about the gift of speaking in tongues. And as he looked at me with eyes full of fire yet overflowing with love, he said, "When my people pray in tongues, they are not using human words. They are stepping into heaven's own language. They are aligning themselves with my Father's perfect will, bypassing the limits of their own reasoning and weaknesses, and entering a flow of prayer that cannot be hindered by doubt, fear, or lack of understanding." And he allowed me to see in the Spirit how every word spoken in tongues rose like incense before the throne, carrying petitions, praises, and declarations directly to the heart of God. And I realized that what many dismiss as babbling or confusion is actually the divine communication of the Spirit, a bridge between earth and heaven, a channel through which rivers of living water flow freely in that realm of glory. I was shown how countless believers were living beneath their inheritance, struggling with weakness, worry, and confusion, because they had not tapped into this reservoir of power. And Jesus said, if only my people would pray in tongues daily, they would never walk empty. Their spirits would be recharged, their faith would be ignited, and their souls would be lifted above the weight of this world. And I saw it like a great generator connected to heaven's power, and every time someone prayed in tongues, their light grew brighter, their strength multiplied, and their atmosphere shifted, because the Spirit was building them up, fortifying their inner man beyond what natural understanding could ever achieve. I was also shown how, when we pray in tongues, mysteries hidden in the heart of God are released into our lives, and though the mind may not comprehend, the Spirit is receiving scrolls of revelation, strategies for the future, and answers to prayers we have not yet prayed with words. And it became clear to me that speaking in tongues is not about trying to understand with the brain, but about surrendering to the Spirit who knows all things. And in that surrender, destinies are shaped, doors are opened, and the unseen becomes reality in the natural. And I felt the weight of responsibility that we must not neglect what heaven has freely given us. Then I saw how tongues operate as a weapon in the unseen realm. Arrows of fire shooting forth from the mouths of believers who prayed in the Spirit, striking the enemy's camp with precision and authority, and demons scattering in terror because they could not decode or resist the language of heaven. And Jesus said, "This is why the enemy has fought so hard to bring confusion and division about tongues, because he fears what he cannot understand or stop." And I understood that every believer who chooses to pray in tongues is waging victorious warfare, breaking chains before they ever manifest in the natural, and protecting their lives and families with divine covering. But above all else, Jesus revealed to me that speaking in tongues is a love language, an intimate communion between the believer and him, a place where words fail, but the Spirit groans, sighs, and sings mysteries of love directly to the throne. And he said, when you pray in tongues, you are not only fighting, not only receiving power, you are whispering your heart to me, and I am pouring back my heart into you. And in that holy exchange, your spirit is united with mine in ways you cannot imagine. And I realized that to neglect tongues is to neglect intimacy with the one who gave everything for us, but to embrace it is to enter a relationship deeper than words, stronger than knowledge, and more beautiful than anything this world can offer. You said, Keynote 2, expend it into the 600 words, don't ending sentences. Don't add any headings, ChatGPT said. When the Lord opened my eyes in that encounter, he allowed me to see that speaking in tongues is far more than a religious exercise or a moment of emotional expression. It is heaven's way of aligning us with the will of God beyond what our natural mind can reach. And Jesus said to me that when his children open their mouths and allow the Spirit to flow in tongues, they step into a divine current, a supernatural stream where prayers are not limited by weakness, distraction, or ignorance, but carried directly into the presence of the Father with accuracy and power. And he showed me that our human prayers, though sincere, are often limited, sometimes misdirected, and sometimes hindered by doubt or fear, but tongues bypass all of that. Tongues travel a straight line from the spirit of the believer to the heart of God, and in that perfect communication the impossible becomes possible. As I listened to his words, he revealed to me how often people rely only on their own understanding in prayer, and while that has value, it cannot compare to the unlimited wisdom of the Spirit. And he said, when you pray in tongues, you are allowing my Spirit to pray through you. You are stepping out of your small perspective and entering my eternal perspective. You are asking not according to your limited sight, but according to my perfect will. And in that moment I saw a vision of rivers flowing from the mouths of believers, each river carrying life, healing, breakthrough, and miracles. And the Lord said, this is what I intended when I poured out the Spirit at Pentecost, not that you would struggle with words, but that you would overflow with power. In that place I felt how tongues strengthen the weary heart and fortify the weak soul, because as the Spirit intercedes within us, he deposits courage, peace, and hope that cannot be explained by logic. And I saw people weighed down by burdens suddenly rise with light in their faces and strength in their steps as they prayed in tongues. For though they did not understand what they were saying, their spirits were being nourished with living bread and heavenly wine. And Jesus said, this is why Paul declared that the one who speaks in tongues edifies himself, because the Spirit is feeding the inner man, lifting him above the storms of this world. Then he showed me another vision, a battlefield where the forces of darkness sought to oppress believers. But every time someone prayed in tongues, fire came forth from their lips like a shield and a sword, pushing back the enemy and breaking chains that had bound them for years. And the Lord said, my child, tongues are not only for personal strength, they are weapons of warfare. They dismantle strategies of enemy, they release angelic armies, they destroy confusion and plant victory in advance. And I realized why the devil resists this gift so strongly, because every believer who prays in tongues is a warrior armed with an unstoppable weapon. And then with such tenderness he reminded me that tongues is not only about power or battle, it is about intimacy with him, a secret language of the Spirit that draws the believer close to the heart of Christ. And he said, when you pray in tongues, you are speaking secrets with me. You are resting in my embrace, and you are allowing my love to flow into you without the limitation of human words. And I understood that tongues is the Spirit's way of deepening our love relationship with the Lord, of bringing us into places of worship where words fail. But the soul sings mysteries only heaven understands, and in that communion the believer is transformed, renewed, and filled with glory beyond description. You said, Keynote 3, expend it into the 600 words, don't ending sentences. Don't add any headings, ChatGPT said. When I continued in that heavenly encounter, the Lord opened before me a deeper revelation about how tongues unlock hidden mysteries that are sealed within his heart, and he showed me that every believer has a destiny written before the foundation of the world, a scroll filled with assignments, promises, and breakthroughs. But many never fully walk into it because they rely only on their limited understanding and natural prayers. And he said, when my people pray in tongues, their spirit is reaching into those sealed scrolls and drawing down what has already been written for their lives. They may not know it in their mind, but in the spirit they are pulling into reality the plans I designed before time began. And I saw visions of scrolls opening as tongues were released, scrolls filled with light and fire that descended into the lives of those who prayed. And with each syllable mysteries became manifestations and unseen plans became visible victories in that moment. I realized that tongues are not random sounds but divine codes, heavenly languages that unlock doors no human key can open. And Jesus said, "Every time you pray in tongues, you are declaring my promises over your future. You are authorizing heaven to move in areas you cannot see yet. You are shaping the unseen long before you step into it. And though mind may say you do not understand, the Spirit rejoices because it knows that heaven is writing history through your mouth." And I saw a picture of a man praying in tongues with tears on his face, not knowing what to say. Yet above him angels were receiving instructions, assignments were being dispatched, and chains were breaking off generations. And I understood that praying in tongues is not only for personal edification, but for divine orchestration. The Lord also showed me how tongues create alignment in families, nations, and even in future generations. And he said, when you allow the Spirit to pray through you, you are not just praying for yourself. You are allowing me to move through time, to intervene in situations yet to come, to shield your children and your children's children, and to set in motion blessings that will outlive you. And I saw a grandmother praying in tongues in her secret place, unaware that her prayers were protecting her grandchildren decades later, guiding them into salvation, shielding them from accidents, and leading them into divine encounters. And I knew then that tongues are timeless prayers, words planted into eternity that will bear fruit. When the appointed moment arrives, then I was shown how tongues unlock wisdom and creativity. And Jesus said, "Many of my children are seeking answers, inventions, ideas, and solutions to problems, but they limit themselves to their intellect. Yet when they pray in tongues, they are opening the gate of divine creativity." And I saw believers praying and then suddenly receiving business strategies, books to be written, songs to be sung, and answers to complex issues that no education could provide, because the Spirit had released into their minds what their spirits had already received. And I understood that tongues is a womb of divine ideas, birthing answers that change not only individual lives but entire communities and nations. Finally, the Lord showed me that tongues carry the mysteries of intercession, and he said, "There are burdens you do not know, dangers you cannot see, people you have never met, yet when you yield to the Spirit and pray in tongues, you are standing in the gap for them. You are interceding for a missionary in danger, for a soul on the brink of despair, for a nation about to face calamity, and you may never know on earth the lives you saved, the battles you won, and the victories you birthed, but in eternity it will be revealed how every groan and every utterance in tongues was a weapon of salvation in my hands. And in that revelation my heart burned with urgency never to neglect this gift, but to treasure it, practice it, and allow it to shape my destiny and the destiny of others through the mysteries it releases. You said, Keynote 4, expend it into the 600 words, don't ending sentences, don't add any headings, ChatGPT said. As I remained in that heavenly vision, the Lord began to show me how tongues are not only for personal edification or for unlocking mysteries, but they are also powerful weapons in the unseen battle. And he opened before me a vast battlefield where multitudes of believers were walking with burdens on their shoulders, and shadows of darkness sought to bind and weaken them. But then I saw some who opened their mouths and began to pray in tongues, and suddenly fire streamed forth like arrows of light, piercing through the ranks of the enemy and scattering them in every direction. And Jesus said to me, "This is why the enemy hates this gift so much, because he cannot decode the language of heaven. He cannot resist the fire of the Spirit, and he cannot stop the authority that is released when my people pray in tongues. For every utterance is a weapon forged in heaven and sent to earth for victory." I saw chains falling from men and women as they prayed, addictions breaking, depression lifting, sickness losing its grip, and confusion giving way to clarity, because tongues release divine intervention into places that human effort could never reach. And the Lord said, when you pray in tongues, you are enforcing the victory of the cross over every lie of the enemy. You are declaring in a language of fire that the devil is defeated, that principalities have no power, and that the blood has already won the battle. And in that moment it became clear to me that many Christians fight with their own strength, using their intellect and emotions. But when you step into tongues, you fight with sword of the Spirit, a weapon no enemy can withstand. He then showed me how tongues silence the accuser, and I saw the devil standing to accuse God's people, whispering words of condemnation and guilt. But when a believer began to pray in tongues, the accusations could not stand. The voice of the accuser was drowned out by the roar of heaven, and the Lord said, tongues release my verdict over your life. They silence the lies of the enemy, and they establish the truth of my word. And I realized that every believer who embraces tongues is walking in a courtroom of victory, where the judge himself declares them free, and the enemy has no evidence that can remain. Then I was taken to see intercessors who prayed in tongues, and their prayers rose like firestorms over nations, and wherever the flames reached, plots of darkness were exposed, wars were delayed, disasters were averted, and revival fires began to burn. And the Lord said, my child, tongues are not just for your own breakthrough, they are for the nations. For when you yield to the Spirit, you may be interceding for leaders, for governments, for people in danger. And though you may not know the details, I am using your voice as a trumpet to shift the atmosphere over entire regions. And I understood that tongues is global warfare, carrying authority not just for an individual, but for nations and generations. The Lord also revealed to me that tongues break spiritual barriers within families, and I saw generational curses, cycles of poverty, patterns of sickness, and chains of fear that had run through bloodlines for centuries. But as one believer prayed in tongues, fire cut through those lines, breaking what the enemy had established, and blessings began to flow into children and grandchildren. And the Lord said, this is the power of tongues. It is the cry of the Spirit breaking barriers you cannot even see, and releasing freedom for those who come after you. And I knew then that tongues is a weapon not only for yourself, but for those you love, a weapon that creates inheritance and shifts legacies. And then with a deep and tender voice, the Lord reminded me that tongues keep the believer hidden in him during warfare. And he said, when you pray in tongues, the enemy does not know your strategy. He cannot intercept your prayers, and he cannot stop what I am doing, because you are praying in a code written by heaven and known only by me. And in that moment I felt the security of being hidden in the shadow of his wings, covered, protected, and empowered. And I realized that praying in tongues is the safest and strongest way to wage war, because it is not me fighting, it is Christ in me, releasing his victory through the power of the Spirit, you said. Keynote 5, expend it into the 600 words, don't ending sentences. Don't add any headings, ChatGPT said. As the Lord continued to reveal these mysteries, he showed me that tongues are not only about alignment, power, revelation, or warfare, but above all they are about intimacy with him. And he said to me with a voice full of tenderness, when my people pray in tongues, they are speaking love directly into my heart. They are entering into communion that goes beyond words, beyond language, beyond human limitation. And in that sacred moment I understood that tongues are not merely a spiritual tool, but a love language between the bride and the bridegroom, a secret conversation that only heaven understands. And I saw streams of light flowing upward as believers prayed in tongues, and those streams were like songs, whispers and sighs of the heart carried to the throne. And Jesus said, when they pray this way, I draw them near. I hold them close, and I pour my Spirit into them in a way that words cannot express. I saw a man on his knees, broken and without words, tears streaming down his face. And as he began to pray in tongues, the atmosphere shifted, the heaviness lifted, and the presence of the Lord wrapped around him like a blanket. And I heard Jesus say, see, this is intimacy when his words fail. My Spirit speaks for him when his mind is overwhelmed. My Spirit carries him when his heart cannot find expression, I give him utterance, and I pour my comfort into his soul. And it struck me deeply that tongues are the language of lovers, the cry of the bride to the bridegroom, the sigh of a soul longing for union with its Maker. The Lord then revealed that intimacy through tongues transformed the believer's inner life, and he said, "Many seek me with their minds, many seek me with their strength. But when they yield in tongues, they are seeking me with their spirit, and I meet them in that place. I speak back into their spirit. I release joy unspeakable, peace that passes understanding, and love that casts out fear." And I saw how praying in tongues was like opening a door into the secret chambers of the King. And once inside, the believer was embraced, healed, strengthened, and filled with light that no darkness could resist. And I realized that intimacy through tongues is not ritual, it is an encounter. I was also shown that in intimacy, tongues deepen worship, and I saw a gathering of believers worshiping in their own languages. But when they shifted into tongues, the sound became like a symphony of heaven, one voice, one song, one fragrance of adoration, and the presence of the Lord filled the place like a mighty river. And he said, "This is why tongues are precious, because they lift worship beyond human expression. They make it pure, unfiltered, and pleasing to my heart." And I felt how every syllable was like incense, sweet and holy, and it rose before the throne in perfection, because it was born of the Spirit and not of the flesh. The Lord also made me understand that intimacy through tongues is the place where transformation happens quietly, where broken hearts are mended, where wounds are healed, where fear dissolves into love. And he said, "Many think of tongues only as power, but they must also know it as my embrace. For when you pray in tongues, you are not only asking, not only fighting, not only receiving revelation. You are resting in my arms, and I am whispering back into your spirit that you are mine, you are loved, you are chosen, and you are never alone." And I saw people who had been rejected, abandoned, and forgotten by the world praying in tongues and suddenly filled with joy, because they had entered the secret place of intimacy with the one who never leaves or forsakes them. Finally, the Lord said, "Tongues is the doorway to abiding fellowship with me. It is not just a momentary prayer, but a continual flow of communion, a way to walk with me daily in love and closeness." And he said, "If my children would give themselves to tongues not only for battle or for power, but for love, they would find themselves walking with me as Enoch walked. They would hear my heartbeat. They would know my secrets. They would live not as servants, but as beloved friends." And in that revelation, I understood that tongues is the Spirit's invitation into a love so deep and eternal that nothing on earth can compare, a love that transforms every part of life until the believer shines with the likeness of Christ. You said, Keynote 6, expended into the 600 words, don't ending sentences. Don't add any headings, ChatGPT said. As the vision drew to its close, the Lord impressed upon me that the gift of tongues is not something to be debated, argued about, or feared, but something to be embraced, cherished, and practiced daily as a vital part of the Christian life. And he said with great urgency, "My people perish not because the enemy is stronger, but because they neglect the weapons and treasures I have already placed in their hands." And tongues is one of those treasures, a pearl of great price that too many have cast aside. And I saw how countless believers walked in weakness, weighed down by worry, trapped by cycles of defeat, and yet right within them was a gift that could break those cycles, release strength, and open the heavens over their lives. But because of misunderstanding or neglect, they had left it dormant. And the Lord's heart was grieving because his children were living beneath their inheritance. He showed me that to neglect tongues is to choose to walk with half of the armor missing, to live with only a portion of the fire, to operate in faith without the full supply of the Spirit. And he said, "I poured out my Spirit so that my people would never be powerless, never be voiceless, never be empty. Yet so many quenched the very flame I gave them." And I understood then that Speaking in tongues is not a luxury for the few, but a necessity for all who desire victory, strength, and intimacy with the Lord. For it is the lifeline of power in a world full of battles, the breath of the Spirit in a dry land, the language of heaven in a fallen earth. Then I was shown how those who discipline themselves to pray in tongues daily carry an atmosphere of glory. And I saw them walking through dark places, but light surrounded them. I saw them enter situations of confusion, but wisdom flowed through them. I saw them face storms, but peace anchored them, because the Spirit within them had been stirred, and his rivers were flowing continuously. And the Lord said, "This is the life I intended, not survival but overflow, not despair but victory, not emptiness but fullness." And I realized that tongues is one of the most consistent ways to remain filled with the Spirit, to keep the lamp burning, to walk in continual renewal. He also made it clear to me that praying in tongues is a key to perseverance in faith, because when trials come and the mind grows weary, tongues keeps the spirit alive. When discouragement whispers and words fail, tongues lifts the soul above despair. When temptation presses and strength seems gone, tongues pours fresh power into the heart. And he said, "Those who lean on their own strength will faint, but those who yield to my Spirit will rise on wings like eagles." And in that moment I knew that tongues is a secret of endurance, a hidden engine that keeps faith alive when everything else threatens to collapse. The Lord then revealed that tongues is also preparation for the days ahead, because there are storms coming, there are trials, there are challenges this world has never seen. And he said, "Those who walk in their own wisdom will stumble, but those who walk in the Spirit will stand." And he said, "Praying in tongues is training your spirit, strengthening your foundation, preparing you to face what is to come without fear. Because when your roots are deep in the Spirit, no wind can uproot you, no storm can shake you." And I saw believers standing strong while everything around them crumbled, because they had built themselves up through constant communion in tongues. Finally, he reminded me that tongues must not only be received but practiced, nurtured, and allowed to grow. And he said, "The more you pray in tongues, the deeper the well becomes, the stronger the river flows, the greater the fire burns. But if you neglect it, the well dries, the fire dims, and the river slows." And I realized that tongues is like a muscle that grows with use, a gift that unfolds with practice, a treasure that reveals its depth. More you cherish it, and I felt his love urging me to tell his people, "Do not neglect this gift, do not leave it dormant, do not be content with a dry spirit when I have given you living water." For tongues is not only a gift, it is a lifeline, a weapon, a key, and above all a love language that keeps you in constant communion with me. And I left that encounter with the fire in my heart that every believer must embrace tongues as a daily practice, for in it lies power, intimacy, and victory that will carry them until the day they see the Lord face to face.